Welcome to part 1 of how to construct a circle graph or pie chart. In this video we'll construct a circle graph or pie chart from a table of percentages and fractions. In part 2 we'll take a look at creating a circle graph or pie chart from raw data. Let's start with some background information. A circle represents 360 degrees, meaning if we started with an initial ray of an angle and we rotated it all the way around the circle, like so, we would have a total of 360 degrees. And then secondly, for measuring and constructing angles, we often use a protractor. And the reason these two ideas are important, one way to divide up a pie chart or circle graph proportionally would be to measure angles and then construct circular sectors or section off pieces of the circle. To get an idea of how this works, let's take a look at an animation. Here we see a pie chart or circle graph that represents which 4 websites people visit the most. If we take a look at this orange section here, notice that almost 46% of the people visit this website, therefore it must represent 46% of the circle. One way to determine this size of the circle would be to determine 46% of 360 degrees and then measure it with a protractor. Notice as the percent increases, the percent will take up a larger section or larger sector of the circle. So these pieces of the circle, called sectors, must be proportional to the percent of data that it represents. So let's take a look at how we're going to do this. Here are the steps to making a circle graph or pie chart. We're going to first determine what percent of the data is from each category, and in this video it will be given to us as a percent or a fraction. Next we'll determine what percent of 360 degrees represents each category, and then we'll divide up the circle. So let's go ahead and give it a try. Let's say an instructor conducts a survey of his students, and he asks how many hours they studied for the last test. And the results are given here. If we want to construct a circle graph to represent the outcomes of the survey, we need to determine a certain percentage of the circle. And one way to do that is to determine what percent of 360 degrees would represent each category. So for example, for this first category, since 25% of the people answered between 0 and 1, we want to find 25% of 360 degrees. And the way we do that is we convert the percentage to a decimal and then multiply by 360 degrees. For the second category, we want to determine 30% of 360 degrees. The third category would be 25% of 360 degrees. And the last category would be 20% of 360 degrees. Well, I know 25% of 360 degrees would be 1/4 of the circle, or 90 degrees. So this would be 90 degrees, and then so would the third category. And so for the second category, we'll multiply 0.3 or 0.30 times 360. That tells us this category here would be 108 degrees of the circle. And the fourth category would be 0.20 times 360, or 72 degrees. So now what we'll do is use our protractor and measure off each angle that would represent each category of this survey. So we'll go ahead and start by constructing the initial ray here. The first category would be 90 degrees, so that would be from 0 to 90 degrees. That would be this sector here. We'll go ahead and label this from 0 to 1. The next category would be 108 degrees, so this would be 90 plus 18 more degrees, so maybe somewhere in here. And this represents between 1 and 2 hours. Now the next category is 90 degrees, so from here to here would be 72 degrees plus 18 more degrees, so it'll be somewhere in here. This was from 2 to 3 hours. And then the last category here is 72 degrees, which represents 3 or more hours. Then a lot of times they'll shade these with a nice color so they stand out. So to construct a circle graph or pie chart, it is important that we have a protractor so we can make these sectors the correct size to represent each category correctly. Let's go and take a look at one more. Let's say this is the results of a survey that asks people how far they drive to work or to school. And the only difference between this one and the last one is that the results are now given as a fraction of the total instead of a percent of the total. So the idea is going to be exactly the same. We need to determine half of 360 degrees for this category, 1/5 of 360 degrees for this category, and so on. So one way to determine half of 360 degrees is to find the product of 1/2 and 360. Of course, half of 360 would be 180 degrees. To find 1/5 of 360, we multiply 1/5 and 360 degrees. This is the same. The last is 1/10 of 360 degrees. Well, I know 1/10 of 360 degrees would be the same as dividing by 10, so this is 36 degrees. And then 1/5 is 2/10, so we can just multiply 36 by 2 to find 1/5 of 360 degrees. That would be 72 degrees, and this would be the same. But let's go ahead and show how you can do this on the calculator as well. It's the same process. Let's just check this second one. It would be 1/5 times 360. And there we go. Okay, let's go ahead and measure these angles to divide up our circle. Well, this first category is pretty straightforward. 180 degrees would be half the circle. This is the category from 0 to 10. The next category would be 72 degrees. So if we start here at 180, 180 plus 72 would be 252. So we'd be somewhere in here. This is between 11 and 20. Now if I could, I'd probably just rotate this protractor and measure off another 72 degrees. I can't do that on this screen, so we'll go ahead and just make the best of it. We left off at 252 degrees. I'll just add another 72 degrees on top of that. So I'll go over to 324 degrees. Somewhere like this. This would be from 21 to 30 miles. And the last category here would be 31 plus miles. Let's go ahead and color code each category. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Next video we'll take a look at how we do the same type of construction when we're given the raw data rather than the percentage or fraction for each category.